The sun rose over Ouagadougou like a forge being stoked to life, its heat already pressing down on the sprawling capital of Burkina Faso before 7 in the morning. The streets were beginning to stir with the familiar rhythm of West African commerce, vendors setting up their stalls, motorcycles weaving through the early traffic, and the distant sound of djembe drums from a morning ceremony in one of the older neighborhoods. In the presidential compound, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was already dressed in his military fatigues, his eyes scanning reports that had arrived during the night. At 37 years old, Traoré had become the world's youngest head of state, thrust into leadership through circumstances that reflected both Burkina Faso's struggles and its hunger for change. The reports on his desk spoke of security concerns in the northern regions, of economic initiatives that needed his approval, and of diplomatic meetings scheduled for the coming days. But today's journey was different. Today, he would travel to the rural province of Mouhoun, to visit communities that had been affected by recent insurgent activities and to oversee the distribution of agricultural support. His aide, Lieutenant Caboret, entered the office with the morning briefing. "Mr. President, the convoy is ready. We have 4 vehicles, security detail in position, and the route has been cleared by advance teams." Traoré nodded, gathering his papers. "What's the situation in Mouhoun currently?" he asked. Caboret consulted his notes. "Stable, sir. The local defense volunteers have reported no unusual activity in the past 72 hours. The communities are eager to meet with you." Traoré stood and adjusted his red beret, the symbol that had become synonymous with his leadership. As they walked toward the convoy, he thought about the people he would meet today. Farmers struggling with drought, mothers worried about their children's safety, village elders trying to maintain peace in uncertain times. These were the people he had sworn to protect, the reason he accepted the burden of leadership when his country called. The morning air outside was already thick with heat. The convoy consisted of 4 land cruisers, their windows tinted against both sun and prying eyes. Traoré climbed into the second vehicle, flanked by his security detail. The journey from Ouagadougou to Mouhoun would take them through the central plateau, across terrain that shifted from populated areas to sparse rural landscapes. As the convoy pulled out of the compound, Traoré watched the city pass by his window. Children in school uniforms walking in groups, women carrying goods on their heads with that graceful balance perfected over generations, men gathered under the shade of baobab trees for morning discussions. This was the Burkina Faso he fought for, the one that existed beyond politics and power struggles. This was the land of honest people, as Thomas Sankara had named it, and Traoré felt the weight of that legacy every single day. Chapter 2. The convoy moved steadily northwest, leaving behind the concrete and crowds of Ouagadougou for the open roads of the countryside. The landscape transformed gradually, urban density giving way to fields of struggling millet crops, their golden stalks fighting against the persistent drought that had plagued the Sahel for years. Small villages appeared and disappeared along the roadside, collections of round mud brick homes with thatched roofs, their simplicity belying the rich cultural traditions maintained within them. Inside the vehicle, Traoré reviewed his notes for the community meetings scheduled for later that day. His security chief, Major Ouedraogo, sat across from him, constantly monitoring radio communications from the other vehicles. The major was a seasoned soldier who had served during some of Burkina Faso's most challenging security crises, and his vigilance never wavered. "The advance team reports clear conditions ahead, Mr. President Adini," Ouedraogo said, his voice steady and professional. Through the window, Traoré observed the people of rural Burkina Faso going about their daily lives. A group of Fulani herders guided their cattle across a dry riverbed, their traditional clothing catching the wind. Women worked in communal fields, their songs carrying across the distance, ancient melodies that had accompanied labor in these lands for centuries. Children waved at the passing convoy, their excitement at seeing official vehicles a momentary break from their daily routines. The president smiled and waved back, a gesture that his security team had learned to accept despite their preference for minimal visibility. But Traoré believed in being seen by his people, in acknowledging their existence and their struggles. He had risen to power partly because previous leaders had become too distant, too removed from the realities that ordinary Burkinabé faced every day. He would not make that same mistake. As they drove further into Mouhoun province, the road quality deteriorated. Potholes became more frequent, and the convoy slowed to navigate the rougher terrain. This was typical of rural infrastructure in Burkina Faso. Decades of underdevelopment and limited resources meant that communities outside major cities often struggled with basic services. It was one of the many issues Traoré had vowed to address, though he knew that such changes required time and resources that his country was still working to secure. The radio crackled with routine check-ins from the advanced security team positioned kilometers ahead. Everything appeared normal. The convoy maintained its steady pace, dust billowing behind the vehicles like a trailing cloud. Inside, the air conditioning fought against the oppressive heat, creating a bubble of cool air that seemed almost artificial compared to the harsh reality outside. Traoré continued his review of documents, occasionally looking up to take in the scenery, his mind already preparing for the conversations he would have with community leaders in just a few hours. Chapter 3. 2 hours into the journey, the convoy approached a particularly remote stretch of road. Here, the landscape became even more sparse, scattered acacia trees providing inadequate shade, the ground baked hard by relentless sun, and the horizon shimmering with heat mirages that made distance difficult to judge. It was the kind of terrain that tested both vehicles and spirits, where the Sahel's harsh character revealed itself without pretense. Major Ouedraogo received an update from the lead vehicle. "Mr. President, we're approaching the Nakambe Valley crossing. The advance team checked the bridge yesterday evening and confirmed it was structurally sound. We should cross without issue." Traoré nodded absently, his attention drawn to a document outlining proposed agricultural reforms. The bridge in question was a modest concrete structure spanning a seasonal riverbed that only saw water during the brief rainy season. For most of the year, it stood over cracked earth and scattered rocks, a testament to the region's water scarcity. The convoy slowed as it approached the bridge approach. This was standard protocol. Security teams always exercised extra caution at potential choke points where ambushes might occur. Traoré had learned to recognize these moments of heightened vigilance, the subtle shift in his security details' demeanor as they scanned for threats. But the area appeared deserted. No vehicles, no people, just the endless expanse of scrubland stretching in all directions. Lieutenant Cabaret, riding in the lead vehicle, maintained constant communication with the rest of the convoy. Approaching bridge structure. Visibility is clear. No movement detected. The first vehicle slowed to a near crawl as it began the approach to the bridge. In the president's vehicle, Major Ouedraogo's hand moved unconsciously to his sidearm, a habit born from years of service in conflict zones. Then, something unexpected happened. From behind a cluster of dried bushes near the roadside, a donkey emerged, a grey, weathered animal with the patient expression that donkeys seem to be born with. It walked directly into the middle of the road, positioning itself squarely in the convoy's path. The lead vehicle came to a complete stop, its driver honking the horn in an attempt to move the stubborn creature. But the donkey remained unmoved, standing its ground with the kind of determination that only donkeys possess. "Sir, we have an obstruction," came the report over the radio. "A donkey has blocked the road, attempting to clear it now." Traoré looked up from his papers, a slight smile crossing his face despite the situation. In rural Africa, such encounters with livestock were common, though the timing was inconvenient. 2 security personnel exited the lead vehicle and approached the animal, attempting to guide it off the road. The donkey, however, had other ideas. For several minutes, a peculiar scene unfolded. Trained security officers engaged in a gentle struggle with an obstinate farm animal. The donkey would take a step to the side, only to return to its position in the center of the road. It brayed loudly, a sound that carried across the empty landscape, as if protesting the intrusion into its territory. Traoré watched the scene with a mixture of amusement and impatience, aware that their schedule was being disrupted by something as simple as a wandering donkey. Chapter 4. The standoff continued for nearly 5 minutes. Inside the presidential vehicle, Traoré's initial amusement began to give way to concern about the delay. They had a schedule to maintain, and communities were waiting for their arrival. Major Ouedraogo spoke into his radio, his tone professional but firm. "Can we establish who owns this animal? Someone from a nearby village should be able to move it." The security team scanned the surrounding area, but no farm or homestead was visible in the immediate vicinity. This was puzzling. Donkeys in rural Burkina Faso typically stayed near their owners' compounds, used for transporting water, firewood, and goods to market. A solitary donkey on a remote stretch of road was unusual. Lieutenant Traoré suggested, "We could guide the convoy around it, sir. The terrain looks passable on the eastern side." But Major Ouedraogo shook his head. "We don't deviate from cleared routes. We have no intelligence on the ground conditions off-road. We move the animal or we wait for it to move on its own." It was a security principle that Traoré had come to understand well. In a country facing insurgent threats, unpredictability could be fatal. Sticking to planned routes, even when inconvenient, was a matter of survival. One of the security officers tried a different approach, producing a small piece of bread from his ration pack and attempting to lure the donkey with it. The animal showed interest, taking a few steps forward, but then stubbornly returned to its position. It was as if the creature had a purpose, a determination that transcended normal animal behavior. The officer scratched his head in frustration, looking back at the convoy with an expression that seemed to ask for guidance. Traoré decided to intervene. "Let me try," he said, opening his door despite Major Ouedraogo's immediate protest. "Mr. President, that's not advisable. Please remain in the vehicle." But Traoré was already stepping out into the heat, which hit him like a physical force. He walked toward the donkey, his security detail immediately forming a protective semicircle around him. The animal watched his approach with calm eyes, its ears twitching slightly. "Easy there," Traoré said softly, extending his hand slowly. He had grown up in rural Burkina Faso, in the village of Kera, where animals were part of daily life. He understood their language, their rhythms. The donkey allowed him to come closer, and Traoré gently placed his hand on its neck, feeling the coarse hair and the warmth of the sun-baked hide. "You've made your point, my friend. Now let us pass." For a moment, it seemed like the animal might comply. It turned its head toward Traoré, and their eyes met in one of those curious interspecies moments of connection. Then, from somewhere in the distance, there came a sound, low, rumbling like thunder but different. The ground beneath their feet trembled, just slightly. The donkey's ears went flat against its head, and it brayed again, louder this time, with what sounded like urgency. Major Ouedraogo felt it too. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his hand now firmly on his weapon. The trembling came again, stronger this time. Several of the security team members looked around, confused and alert. Earthquake activity was not common in this region of Burkina Faso, but the sensation was unmistakable. Traoré kept his hand on the donkey, feeling the animal's tension increase. Then, approximately 50 meters ahead of them, beyond where the bridge crossed the dry riverbed, something extraordinary happened. Chapter 5. The ground collapsed. Not gradually, but suddenly and catastrophically. A section of road beyond the bridge, perhaps 15 meters in length, simply gave way. The sound was tremendous. A deep, crushing roar as earth and rock tumbled into a previously hidden void beneath the surface. Dust erupted upward in a massive cloud, obscuring visibility and sending debris flying in all directions. Everyone froze. For a moment, time seemed to stop as the reality of what they were witnessing sank in. The convoy had been seconds away from crossing that bridge and continuing onto the very section of road that had just ceased to exist. If they had been on that stretch when it collapsed, the presidential vehicle would have plunged into what was now revealed as a massive underground cavity, possibly a collapsed mine shaft or eroded underground water channel. The dust slowly settled, revealing the full extent of the collapse. What had appeared to be solid road was now a gaping chasm, its edges ragged and unstable, dropping into darkness below. The bridge itself remained intact, but it now led to nothing, a road that ended in empty air. Major Ouedraogo's face had gone pale. "Mother of God," he whispered, then immediately recovered his professional composure. "All units, halt! Code red! Secure the perimeter immediately." Traoré stood motionless, his hand still on the donkey's neck, staring at the collapsed road. His mind raced through the implications. If the donkey hadn't blocked their path, if they hadn't stopped for those crucial minutes, they would be in that hole right now. The presidential vehicle, possibly multiple vehicles, would have crashed into the cavity. At the speed they had been traveling, survival would have been unlikely. The security detail quickly established a defensive perimeter, weapons drawn, scanning for any sign that this might be part of a coordinated attack, but the area remained deserted except for the convoy, the stubborn donkey, and the terrible evidence of what might have been. Lieutenant Traoré's voice came over the radio, shaken but controlled. "Mr. President, are you injured?" Traoré found his voice. "No, Lieutenant, we're all safe. The donkey stopped us in time." The animal, having served its mysterious purpose, now calmly walked to the side of the road and began to nibble at some sparse vegetation, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Traoré watched it, his scientific mind, trained in geology at the University of Ouagadougou, struggling to reconcile what had just happened with rational explanation. The collapse could be explained by natural causes, underground erosion, perhaps an old mining operation that had weakened the substrate. But the timing, the donkey's behavior, the minutes of delay that had saved them all, that defied easy explanation. Major Ouedraogo approached, his professional mask firmly in place but his eyes betraying his shock. "Sir, we need to evacuate this area immediately. The collapse might extend further. The ground could be unstable." Traoré nodded, but before returning to the vehicle, he looked back at the donkey one more time. The animal raised its head and looked directly at him, and Traoré could have sworn he saw something in those dark eyes, knowledge, purpose, or perhaps just the eternal patience of creatures who exist closer to the earth than humans do. "We need to find out who owns this donkey," Traoré said quietly, "and we need to understand what just happened here." As the convoy carefully reversed, creating distance from the unstable area, news of the incident was already being radioed back to Ouagadougou. Within minutes, the story would spread. How President Traoré's convoy had been saved by a wandering donkey, how divine providence or simple chance had prevented a catastrophe that could have changed the course of Burkina Faso's future. Man, if you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more content like this. Chapter 6. The convoy established a safe position half a kilometer back from the collapsed road. Major Ouedraogo immediately coordinated with military engineers in Ouagadougou, requesting a geological survey team and structural assessment specialists. The collapsed section needed to be evaluated, and the entire route would have to be inspected for similar vulnerabilities. The implications were serious. If one section of this road had collapsed, other areas might be at risk. Traoré sat in his vehicle, his mind processing the close call with the clarity that had made him an effective military officer and leader. Around him, his security team maintained vigilant watch, but their conversations were subdued, marked by the realization of how close they had come to disaster. Lieutenant Traoré appeared at the vehicle's window, his young face still showing signs of shock. "Mr. President, I've contacted the provincial governor. He's sending local officials to investigate the collapse and to search for the donkey's owner." Within an hour, several motorcycles arrived carrying local administrators and traditional leaders from nearby villages. Among them was an elderly man named Souleymane, a village chief who had lived in the region for over 70 years. He approached Traoré's vehicle with the respectful deference accorded to the president, but also with the dignity of age and traditional authority. Traoré stepped out to meet him, and they greeted each other in the traditional manner, with inquiries about health and family. "Mr. President, we heard about the road collapse," Souleymane said in Mouré, the language of the Mossi people. "This is very troubling. That section of road was built over old colonial mining works, though many have forgotten this." Traoré's geological training immediately seized on this information. "Mining works? What type? Gold?" The old man nodded. "Gold and manganese from the French colonial period. The tunnels were abandoned nearly 80 years ago, but we who live here know the ground is not always what it appears to be. This explained the collapse, abandoned mine shafts, weakened over decades, finally giving way under the weight of the road above. But it raised serious questions about infrastructure planning and the need for geological surveys before road construction. Traoré made a mental note to order a comprehensive review of all roads in regions with historical mining activity. The risk to civilian traffic was unacceptable. Then the conversation turned to the donkey. "Do you know who owns the animal that blocked our convoy?" Traoré asked. Souleimane's expression became thoughtful, almost mystical. "That donkey, Mr. President, belongs to no one now. It belonged to old Amadou, a farmer who died 3 weeks ago. The animal wandered off after his death. We have been looking for it, but it seems to have its own path. A chill ran down Traoré's spine despite the heat. A donkey belonging to a deceased owner, appearing at precisely the right moment to prevent a catastrophe. He was a man of science and military precision, not given to superstitious thinking, but he also respected the traditional beliefs of his people. In Burkinabe culture, particularly among the Mossi and other ethnic groups, animals were sometimes seen as messengers, as connections between the visible world and the realm of ancestors. The spirits of this land protect those who serve the people, Solimana said quietly, his old eyes meeting Traoré as young ones. Amadou was a good man. Perhaps his last service was through his faithful companion. Traoré didn't know how to respond to this. Instead, he asked, "Where is the donkey now?" A young official pointed to where the animal stood in the shade of an acacia tree, appearing completely content, as if waiting for something. "I want that donkey cared for," Traoré said firmly. "Find it a good home. Ensure it has food and water. Consider it under presidential protection." The local officials nodded, pleased with this decision. In their eyes, Traoré saw approval, not just for the practical order, but for the respect it showed to the inexplicable event that had saved their president's life. It was a gesture that honored both the rational and the mysterious, the modern and the traditional. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the Sahel landscape in shades of gold and amber, Traoré prepared to return to Ouagadougou. The visit to Mohun would have to be rescheduled, but the day had brought lessons more important than any scheduled meeting could have provided. The convoy would take an alternative route, one that had been thoroughly checked by the advance team. Before leaving, Traoré walked over to where the donkey stood. The animal raised its head from grazing and looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes. Traoré reached out and patted its neck once more. "Thank you, my friend," he whispered. "However this happened, whatever guided you to that road today, thank you." The donkey simply returned to its grazing, unbothered by the weight of the moment, existing in that simple present that animals inhabit so completely. Chapter 7. The return journey to Ouagadougou was quiet, each member of the convoy lost in their own thoughts about mortality and chance, about the thin line between life and death that they had unknowingly approached. Traoré gazed out the window as familiar landscapes passed by, villages preparing for evening, farmers returning from fields, children playing in the cooling air. All of it seemed more precious now, more vivid, as if the brush with disaster had sharpened his perception of life's ordinary beauty. Major Ouedraogo broke the silence. "Mr. President, when we return, there will be questions. The media will want details. How would you like us to handle this?" Traoré considered this carefully. The incident could be spun many ways, as a security failure that allowed the convoy onto an unsafe road, as divine intervention, as mere coincidence. Each interpretation carried implications for how the public would perceive his leadership and the state of national infrastructure. "We tell the truth," Traoré finally said. "An abandoned colonial mine caused a road collapse. We were fortunate to have stopped before reaching it. The incident highlights the need for comprehensive infrastructure review and geological surveys. We will learn from it and prevent similar dangers in the future." It was a characteristically practical response, focusing on solutions rather than drama, though he knew the story of the donkey would take on a life of its own, regardless of official statements. By the time the convoy reached the outskirts of Ouagadougou, the incident had already spread through the city. In the age of mobile phones and social media, news traveled at lightning speed. People gathered in small groups, discussing what they had heard, versions of the story that ranged from accurate to wildly embellished. Some spoke of divine protection over their young president, others of the mysterious ways that ancestors watch over the living. Still others focused on the infrastructure crisis that the collapse represented. At the presidential compound, Traoré's senior advisors were waiting. Their relief at seeing him safe was evident, but their expressions also showed concern about the broader implications. The Minister of Infrastructure looked particularly worried. The collapse would fall under his ministry's responsibility, and questions would inevitably be asked about inspection protocols and maintenance standards. Traoré gathered them in the Situation Room and gave a thorough debriefing. He emphasized the need for action rather than recrimination. "Tomorrow, I want a full report on all roads built over former mining areas. Within 2 weeks, I want a plan for geological surveys and infrastructure assessment. This is not about assigning blame, It's about preventing future incidents that could cost Burkinabe lives. His chief of staff, Marie Cambou, a sharp woman who had served in various government roles for 2 decades, raised a practical concern. Mr. President, the opposition will use this to attack our governance. They'll say we're neglecting basic safety. Traoré nodded. Let them. But they'll have a hard time making that argument stick when we respond with immediate, comprehensive action. Our job isn't to win political arguments, it's to keep people safe. Later that evening, alone in his office, Traoré sat with a cup of strong Burkinabe coffee and allowed himself to truly process what had happened. In his years as a military officer fighting terrorism in the northern regions, he had faced death many times. Firefights, ambushes, close calls with improvised explosives. These were expected hazards of his former role, but today's incident was different. There had been no enemy to fight, no tactical decision to make. Just a donkey, stubborn and insistent, and the ground opening up like the earth itself had chosen to speak. He thought about Amadou, the deceased farmer whose donkey had saved a president. What kind of life had that man lived? Had he worked his fields with dedication, raised his family with love, contributed to his community in quiet ways that never made headlines? The kind of life that represented the majority of Burkinabe, honest, hard-working, unremarked upon by history. And yet, in death, through the peculiar loyalty of his animal, Amadou had changed the course of events. Traoré picked up his phone and called Major Ouedraogo. I want you to find out about Amadou, the farmer who owned the donkey. Find his family. If they're struggling, I want to help them discreetly. It's the least I can do. The major understood without needing explanation. Yes, Mr. President. I'll handle it personally. Chapter 8. News of the incident dominated Burkina Faso's media for the following days. Television stations ran segments analyzing the collapse, interviewing geological experts about mining hazards, and yes, telling and retelling the story of the donkey that blocked the presidential convoy. Some news outlets treated it with journalistic sobriety, focusing on infrastructure issues. Others leaned into the more mystical elements, interviewing traditional priests and spiritual leaders about signs and omens. International media picked up the story as well, though their coverage often missed the nuances of Burkinabe culture. Western outlets framed it as a bizarre coincidence or a quirky human interest story, failing to grasp the deeper resonance it had with local populations. African media, particularly from other Francophone countries, covered it with more cultural sensitivity, understanding the intersection of practical concerns and spiritual interpretations that characterized the public response. Social media exploded with commentary, memes and debates. Young Burkinabe, the demographic that had been instrumental in Traoré's rise to popularity, created digital art celebrating the event. Images of the donkey wearing a red beret like Traoré's circulated widely. Hashtags like Saved by a Donkey and Burkinabe Guardian trended across platforms. The tone was often humorous, but underpinned by genuine affection for their young president and relief at his safety. Opposition politicians, as Marie Cambou had predicted, attempted to use the incident politically. They called for investigations into infrastructure spending, questioned the competence of the roads ministry, and demanded accountability, but their attacks largely fell flat. The government's rapid response, ordering immediate surveys, establishing a special committee for infrastructure review, and publishing preliminary findings transparently, undercut criticism before it could gain momentum. More significantly, the public mood was not receptive to political point-scoring in the wake of what many saw as a miraculous escape. Even those critical of Traoré's policies were generally relieved that the country had avoided the chaos that would have followed a presidential death. Burkina Faso had experienced enough instability in recent years. The prospect of another crisis held little appeal. Within a week, the Geological Survey team completed their preliminary assessment of the collapse site. Their report confirmed what Chief Soliman had said. The road had been built over abandoned colonial-era mining tunnels without proper geological surveys. Decades of erosion had weakened the mineshaft's integrity until finally, under the weight of the road surface and possibly triggered by minor seismic activity, it had catastrophically failed. The report also identified 17 other locations across Burkina Faso where similar risks existed. Roads, buildings, and even whole neighborhoods built over forgotten colonial mining operations without adequate foundation studies. It was a sobering revelation that transformed the incident from a single near miss into a systemic infrastructure crisis demanding national attention. Traoré convened a special cabinet meeting to address the findings. "This is bigger than one collapsed road," he told his ministers. "This is about the legacy of colonialism, not just the political and economic aspects we often discuss, but the physical legacy. They dug holes in our land, extracted our resources, and left without documenting what they'd done. Now, decades later, the ground literally collapses beneath our feet." The Minister of Infrastructure, a technically competent man named Dr. Sawadogo, presented a comprehensive plan. It would require significant resources, mobile ground-penetrating radar teams, geological surveys, and potentially relocating some structures. The timeline was ambitious: 3 years to assess all high-risk areas and 5 years to implement remediation measures. The cost was substantial, but Traoré approved it immediately. "Lives are priceless," he said simply. "We'll find the money." Funding did prove challenging. Burkina Faso's economy, while showing some improvement under Traoré's resource nationalism policies, was still constrained. The gold refinery he had inaugurated was producing revenue, but the country needed every franc for security, education, healthcare, and agricultural support. The infrastructure safety program would require careful budgeting and possibly external financing, despite Traoré's preference for financial independence from Western institutions. A solution emerged from an unexpected source. Several African nations, inspired by Burkina Faso's sovereignty-focused approach and moved by the near tragedy that had been averted, offered technical assistance and equipment. Mali sent a ground-penetrating radar unit and trained operators. Ghana contributed geological expertise. Even private African businesses, part of the Pan-African solidarity movement that Traoré's leadership had helped energize, made donations toward the Infrastructure Safety Fund. It was a small but significant example of the African cooperation that Traoré had been advocating for, nations helping each other solve problems without waiting for Western intervention or assistance. The cynic might note that the contributions were modest compared to the scale of need, but the symbolism was powerful. African solutions to African problems, even if imperfect and incomplete, represented a shift in mindset that resonated across the continent. Chapter 9. 2 weeks after the incident, Traoré insisted on visiting the collapse site again, this time with proper geological equipment and a full engineering team. Major Ouedraogo had objected strenuously. The ground was still unstable, and there was no compelling reason for the president to personally inspect the location. But Traoré was adamant. "I need to see it," he said. "I need to understand what we escaped and what we're dealing with across the country." The visit was carefully planned with extensive safety measures. The engineering team had stabilized the immediate area and established clear safe zones. Traoré arrived by helicopter this time, landing in a cleared field a kilometer from the collapse. As he approached on foot, accompanied by Dr. Sawadogo and geological specialists, the scale of the collapse became apparent. What had seemed like a 15-meter gap from the initial vantage point was actually part of a much larger underground cavity system. The engineers had lowered cameras into the void, revealing a network of tunnels extending in multiple directions. Some showed signs of the hasty mining techniques used in the colonial era: minimal support structures, dangerous extraction methods, and complete disregard for long-term stability. Wooden support beams, rotted and useless now, still bore French colonial markings from the 1930s and 1940s. Dr. Sawadogo explained the technical aspects. "Mr. President, what we're seeing here is typical of colonial extraction operations. They were interested in quick profits, not sustainable development or long-term safety. They created these voids, extracted the valuable minerals, and left. No proper closure procedures, no documentation of tunnel locations, nothing." Traoré listened, his jaw tightening. "How many Burkinabe miners died in these tunnels?" he asked quietly. Dr. Sawadogo shook his head. "We have no records, sir. Colonial authorities didn't maintain detailed worker casualty reports, especially for African laborers. But based on the working conditions evident in these tunnels, it would have been significant." Standing at the edge of the collapse, Traoré felt the weight of history in a visceral way. This hole in the ground was more than a geological hazard. It was a wound in the earth inflicted by colonial exploitation, a physical manifestation of the extraction and neglect that had characterized Burkina Faso's colonial experience. And it had nearly claimed his life, nearly sent his country spiraling back into the instability it was fighting so hard to overcome. One of the geological specialists, a young Burkinabe woman named Dr. Zongo, who had studied at the University of Ouagadougou, approached with additional findings. "Mr. President, we've identified something else. There are indications of indigenous mining in this area that predates the colonial operations by centuries. Our ancestors were mining here long before the French arrived. They used different techniques, smaller tunnels, better support structures, more sustainable approaches." This detail struck Traoré as deeply meaningful. So our people had the knowledge and skill to extract minerals safely, but the colonial operations disregarded that knowledge and imposed their own more destructive methods. Dr. Zongo nodded. "That's what the evidence suggests, sir. It's a pattern we're seeing in our research. Colonial mining destroyed not just the land, but also displaced indigenous knowledge systems that were actually more sophisticated in some ways." Traoré turned to his communications director, who had accompanied the visit. "I want this story told. Not just the collapse, but the full history, indigenous mining knowledge, colonial exploitation, the ongoing consequences. Our people need to understand that the challenges we face aren't just random misfortune. They're the result of specific historical processes that we can identify and work to rectify." As they prepared to leave the site, Traoré noticed something that made him pause. Near the edge of the cleared area, the donkey, Amadou's donkey, was grazing peacefully. The local officials had been caring for it as Traoré had requested, but the animal had apparently wandered back to this area. It raised its head as Traoré approached, regarding him with that same calm expression. "He keeps coming back here," said a local official who had been overseeing the animal's care. "We've taken him to good pasture in the village, given him shelter and food, but he returns to this spot. It's as if he's watching over something." Traoré stood there watching the donkey and made a decision. "Leave him here. Make sure he has water and supplemental food, but let him be where he chooses. And I want a monument placed at this site. Nothing grand, just a simple marker acknowledging what happened and honoring Amadou, whose companion saved lives." The idea of memorializing a farmer and his donkey might have seemed unusual to some, but it resonated with Traoré's understanding of leadership. Great moments often turned on small things. The decisions of ordinary people, the loyalty of a farm animal, the accumulated weight of individual choices and circumstances. History focused on presidents and generals, but it was built by everyone. Chapter 10. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré's near miss at the collapsed road receded from the headlines as other issues demanded attention. Security operations in the northern regions, diplomatic tensions with neighboring countries, economic policy debates, the machinery of governance ground forward with its customary demands. But the incident had changed something in Traoré, a subtle shift that those closest to him noticed. Marie Cambou, his chief of staff, observed it during their daily briefings. "You're different since the collapse," she said one morning, her directness a quality Traoré valued. "More contemplative, maybe, less purely tactical." Traoré considered this observation. "I suppose I am. When you come that close to death, especially in such an unexpected way, it changes your perspective. I think about legacy differently now, not just what policies I implement, but what foundation I'm building for those who come after." This evolved perspective manifested in subtle policy shifts, while Traoré remained committed to his core principles: sovereignty, resource nationalism, Pan-African cooperation. He began to emphasize longer-term institutional building over immediate results. Infrastructure projects were planned with 50-year timelines, rather than 5-year political cycles. Educational initiatives focused not just on current needs, but on creating systems that would outlast any individual administration. He also became more willing to engage with critics and opposition voices. Not that he compromised his principles, but he showed greater patience for dissenting views and alternative approaches. In cabinet meetings, he actively solicited contrary opinions, pushing ministers to defend their proposals against rigorous questioning. "The donkey taught me something," he told his inner circle half-jokingly. Sometimes the thing that blocks your path is actually saving you from disaster. Resistance and opposition aren't always obstacles. Sometimes they're warnings worth heeding. International observers noted this evolution in Traoré's leadership style. Where some had worried about authoritarian tendencies common among young military leaders in Africa, they now saw a more nuanced approach. He remained firm in his convictions and his rejection of Western interference in African affairs, but he demonstrated greater sophistication in how he pursued these goals. The Infrastructure Safety Program became a flagship initiative of his administration. The teams with ground-penetrating radar fanned out across the country, mapping underground hazards and assessing structural risks. It was unglamorous work, the kind of technical governance that didn't generate exciting headlines, but it was essential. Every week brought new discoveries, not always as dramatic as the collapse that had threatened the president, but cumulatively significant for public safety. Dr. Sawadogo's ministry published regular reports, maintaining transparency about findings and remediation efforts. Some discoveries required difficult decisions. Houses built over unstable ground that needed to be relocated, roads that had to be closed pending stabilization work, communities whose entire settlement patterns needed reconsideration. The government provided compensation and support for affected families, though the resources were never quite adequate to fully address the hardship such changes imposed. The initiative also uncovered positive findings. In several locations, the surveys revealed indigenous mining sites that used sophisticated techniques for their time, tunnel designs that had remained stable for centuries, support systems that modern engineers found admirable. Dr. Uzongo led efforts to study these sites, working with traditional knowledge keepers to understand the engineering principles that had guided their ancestors' work. It became a source of national pride, evidence of African ingenuity that challenged narratives of technological backwardness. Traoré made a point of visiting some of these indigenous mining sites, accompanied by both modern engineers and traditional leaders. At one location in the western part of the country, an elder from the Lobi ethnic group explained how their ancestors had selected mining sites through careful observation of rock formations and seasonal water flow, using knowledge passed down through generations. "There they didn't have your machines," the elder said, gesturing at the radar equipment, "but they had eyes that saw deeply and patience to understand the land." These interactions reinforced Traoré's conviction that development didn't require abandoning traditional knowledge for Western approaches. Instead, it meant integrating the best of both, modern technology with indigenous wisdom, contemporary science with ancestral understanding. It was a synthesis that remained elusive in practice, often complicated by the incompatible assumptions embedded in different knowledge systems. But Traoré believed the effort was worthwhile. Chapter 11. 6 months after the collapse, the monument at the site was completed. It was exactly as Traoré had envisioned, simple but dignified. A small plaza with native trees providing shade, a stone marker inscribed in French and Moore telling the story of Amadou and his donkey, and a bronze sculpture of the animal itself, captured in patient stance that donkeys everywhere seem to embody. The artist, a Burkinabe sculptor named Kone, had captured something essential in the work, not romanticized or heroic, but honest and real. The dedication ceremony was a modest affair. Traoré attended with a small delegation, along with Amadou's family, a widow, 3 children, and several grandchildren who had traveled from their village for the occasion. The widow, a woman named Fatoumata who looked older than her years from decades of hard labor, was initially overwhelmed by the attention and the monument. "My husband was just a farmer," she said quietly. "He worked his land, cared for his animals, tried to provide for his family. I don't understand how his donkey saved the president." Traoré took her hands in his, a gesture that surprised his security detail, but felt natural to him. "Your husband lived with integrity and dedication to his family and community. That's not just anything. That's everything. His companion saved my life, yes, but more than that. This event reminded us all of things we forget too easily. That wisdom sometimes comes from unexpected places, that small acts can have profound consequences, that we're all connected in ways we don't always understand." The ceremony included traditional Mossi rituals, led by local spiritual leaders, blessings for the site, and prayers for the peaceful rest of Amadou's spirit. Drummers played ceremonial rhythms that had accompanied such occasions for generations. Children from nearby villages sang songs they had learned specifically for this event. It was deeply rooted in Burkinabe culture, a reminder that even presidential initiatives could honor and emerge from local traditions rather than imposing foreign patterns. The donkey itself, now officially under state protection and care, grazed nearby, oblivious to the significance being attached to its actions. It had become something of a local celebrity, with villagers bringing it choice vegetables and children asking to pet it. The animal tolerated the attention with typical donkey patience, but seemed most content when simply left to graze in peace. After the ceremony, Traoré spent time talking with Amadou's family, asking about the farmer's life and character. They told stories of a man who had been generous with neighbors, who had mediated disputes with fairness, who had taught his children to value honest work and community service. Nothing exceptional by the world's standards, but the kind of life that formed the foundation of functional societies, people doing right by others without expectation of recognition or reward. He would have been confused by all this attention, Amadou's eldest son said, gesturing at the monument and the gathered officials. He believed in doing what was right because it was right, not for recognition. Traoré smiled. Then he was a better man than most of us in public life. We could learn from his example. The government had provided financial support to Amadou's family, not as payment for the donkey's actions, which would have been absurd, but as assistance from a grateful nation to the family of a man whose legacy had taken on unexpected significance. The money would help educate grandchildren, improve the family compound, and ensure Fatoumata's comfort in her remaining years. It was a small gesture measured against the life that had been saved, but it was what could be done. As Traoré prepared to leave the site, he took one last look at the collapsed area, now properly stabilized and marked with safety barriers. Engineering teams had determined that the full extent of the underground cavity system was too unstable to safely preserve, so the decision had been made to fill the void with controlled backfill. It would become solid ground again. The history of what lay beneath literally buried but not forgotten, thanks to the monument and the records now maintained. He thought about the strange chain of events that had led to this moment, a French colonial mining operation decades ago, an old farmer's faithful companion, a stubborn animal blocking a road at precisely the right time, and the ground opening up just beyond where they had stopped. Cause and effect stretched across time in ways that defied simple explanation, weaving together history, chance, and perhaps something else that science couldn't quite capture. Chapter 12. A year after the incident, Burkina Faso had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. The infrastructure safety program had become institutionalized, with dedicated teams and budget allocations, ensuring its continuation beyond any single administration. 17 major hazards had been identified and addressed, with countless smaller risks remediated before they could cause harm. Lives had been saved, though by definition, prevented disasters generated less attention than occurred catastrophes. The story of the donkey remained part of national consciousness. It had been incorporated into school curricula as a case study in infrastructure safety and the importance of heeding unexpected warnings. Artists continued to reference it in their work, paintings, songs, poems, and even a short film that won awards at FESPACO, Burkina Faso's renowned film festival. The monument had become a minor tourist attraction, with both Burkinabe and international visitors stopping to see the site and hear the story. Traoré himself had evolved as a leader. The contemplative quality Marie Cambou had noted had deepened into a more philosophical approach to governance. He remained the determined military officer, committed to Burkina Faso's security and sovereignty, but he balanced this with greater attention to building lasting institutions and empowering others to carry forward the work of national development. In speeches and interviews, he occasionally referenced the incident, though never in self-aggrandizing ways. Instead, he used it to illustrate larger points about humility, about listening to warnings even from unlikely sources, about the importance of addressing infrastructure deficits and learning from history. "A donkey saved my life by making me stop and pay attention," he would say. As leaders, we should all be willing to stop and pay attention when circumstances or our people tell us something isn't right. The international Pan-African movement that had embraced Traoré as a symbol of youthful leadership and resistance to neo-colonialism also adopted the donkey story. It became a metaphor for indigenous wisdom, for the value of what seemed humble or overlooked, for unexpected solutions to contemporary problems. The image of Traoré with his hand on the donkey's neck circulated widely, representing a connection to land and tradition that resonated across the continent. Not everyone interpreted the incident positively. Critics, both domestic and international, suggested it revealed infrastructure incompetence, or that Traoré's government was using a lucky escape to distract from governance failures. Some Western observers dismissed the attention paid to the donkey as superstitious thinking that held back African development. These critiques had limited impact, mostly because the government's substantive response, the Comprehensive Infrastructure Program, demonstrated serious engagement with the real issues the collapse had revealed. Fatoumata, Amadou's widow, occasionally gave interviews when reporters tracked her down in her village. She remained bemused by the attention, but had grown more comfortable with her husband's unexpected posthumous significance. Amadou would tell you that his donkey was stubborn and often difficult, she said with a smile, but he also trusted that animal's instincts. He used to say that donkeys see the world differently than we do, notice things we miss. Maybe he was right. The donkey itself lived out its days in comfort, cared for by local villagers who took their responsibility seriously. It continued to wander near the monument site, as if drawn to that place by something beyond anyone's understanding. When it finally passed away peacefully several years later, it was given a respectful burial near the monument, and a small addition was made to the inscription acknowledging its death and service. Traoré attended the burial, a gesture that might have seemed excessive to some but felt right to him. He had never forgotten those minutes, standing in the heat with his hand on the animal's neck, feeling the trembling ground beneath their feet. The connection transcended rational explanation, existing in that space where human experience touches mystery. As he stood at the graveside while traditional prayers were offered, Traoré reflected on how this single incident had woven itself into the larger story of his presidency and his country's journey. It had been a moment of potential catastrophe, transformed into an opportunity for growth, in infrastructure, in historical awareness, in national self-understanding, not because he or anyone else had planned it that way, but because people had chosen to learn from it rather than simply moving on. That evening, back in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood on the balcony of his office looking out over the city. The lights stretched toward the horizon, each one representing families, businesses, communities, the living fabric of Burkina Faso that he had sworn to serve and protect. The responsibility felt heavier now than it had before the collapse, but also clearer. Leadership wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments, though those came. It was about the daily work of building foundations that would last, of listening to warnings even from unlikely sources, of honoring the ordinary people whose accumulated lives created the possibility of extraordinary change. A donkey had blocked his convoy one hot morning in the Sahel, and in doing so had set in motion a chain of events that touched infrastructure policy, historical awareness, national identity, and personal philosophy. It was, he thought, a very Burkinabe story, practical and mystical, rooted in land and culture, speaking to both immediate needs and deeper meanings. And like all good stories, it would be retold and reinterpreted by future generations, each finding in it the lessons they needed for their own times. The land of honest people, Thomas Sankara had called it. Traoré hoped that through his work, through learning from moments like the collapse and the donkey, through building institutions that served justice and dignity, he was honoring that vision. Not perfectly. Perfection was impossible in governance, but honestly, with dedication to the people and the country that had placed their trust in him. The night deepened over Ouagadougou, stars emerging in the African sky, ancient and constant. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new tests of leadership. But tonight, Traoré allowed himself to simply be grateful, for warning heeded, for disaster avoided, for the mysterious ways that life protects and guides those willing to pay attention. A donkey had saved a president, and in doing so, had reminded a nation of truths too easily forgotten. That was enough. Ois the Entrek, in the Epilogue. 3 years had passed since the morning a stubborn donkey changed the course of Burkina Faso's history. The monument at the collapse site had weathered its first rainy seasons, the bronze sculpture taking on a patina that somehow made it feel more integrated into the landscape, as if it had always been there. The trees planted around the plaza had grown taller, their shade expanding to cover more of the memorial space where visitors came to reflect on the strange convergence of chance, fate, and consequence that had unfolded on that ordinary road. Ibrahim Traoré stood before the monument on a quiet morning, without the usual entourage of security and officials. He had insisted on coming alone, or as alone as a sitting president could ever truly be. Major Ouedraogo and 2 discreet security personnel waited at a respectful distance, understanding that their leader needed this moment of solitude. The sun was just beginning its ascent, painting the Sahel landscape in soft shades of gold and amber that reminded Traoré why he loved this land so fiercely. He ran his fingers over the inscription on the monument, feeling the carved letters that told Amadou's story in both French and Mooré. The words had been carefully chosen to honor the farmer's life without exaggerating or mythologizing it. Amadou Ouedraogo, farmer and father, whose faithful companion warned of danger and saved lives. May we always remember that wisdom comes from unexpected places, and that the humble among us often carry the greatest truths. Simple words, but they captured something essential about the values Traoré wanted his administration to embody. The infrastructure safety program that had emerged from that day's near tragedy had exceeded even optimistic projections. What had begun as an emergency response to identified hazards had evolved into a comprehensive national initiative that was transforming how Burkina Faso approached development. The teams with ground-penetrating radar had mapped over 80% of the country's major roads and urban areas, identifying and remedying countless potential disasters before they could claim lives. The program had become a model for other African nations facing similar legacy issues from colonial-era exploitation. Dr. Ouedraogo, the infrastructure minister, had reported just last week that the initiative had likely prevented at least 12 major collapses and countless smaller incidents. Roads had been rerouted, buildings had been reinforced or relocated, and entire communities had been moved from unstable ground to safer locations. The human cost of these relocations was real. Families uprooted, traditional settlement patterns disrupted, the pain of leaving ancestral lands, but the alternative, waiting for the ground to open beneath schools, hospitals, and homes, was unacceptable. More significantly, the program had sparked a renaissance of interest in indigenous knowledge systems. Dr. Zongo, the young geologist who had identified pre-colonial mining sites during the initial investigation, now led a research institute dedicated to studying traditional engineering and environmental management practices. Her team worked with elders from various ethnic groups, documenting techniques and wisdom that had been passed down through generations but never formally recorded. They had discovered sustainable mining practices, sophisticated water management systems, and architectural innovations that predated European contact by centuries. This research had practical applications. Modern engineers were incorporating principles from traditional mossy architecture into new building designs, creating structures better adapted to Burkina Faso's climate and conditions. Agricultural development programs were integrating indigenous crop rotation and soil management techniques with contemporary scientific knowledge, achieving better results than purely modern approaches had delivered. It was the synthesis Traoré had envisioned, respecting tradition while embracing innovation, honoring the past while building the future. The international response to Burkina Faso's infrastructure initiative had been mixed, reflecting the complex politics surrounding Traoré's leadership. Western development agencies had offered assistance, though often with conditions attached that Traoré found unacceptable. He had politely declined most of these offers, preferring to fund the work through Burkina Faso's own resources, primarily revenue from the nationalized gold mines and the new refinery that processed ore domestically rather than exporting it raw. The decision came at a cost. Progress was slower than it might have been with external funding, but it preserved sovereignty and ensured that the program served Burkinabe interests rather than donor agendas. African nations had been more straightforward in their support. Mali, Niger, Ghana, and Senegal had all sent technical teams to learn from Burkina Faso's experience and adapt the approach to their own contexts. The alliance of Sahel states, which Burkina Faso had formed with Mali and Niger, had made infrastructure safety a shared priority, pooling resources and expertise to address common challenges. It was Pan-African cooperation in practice, the kind of mutual support that didn't depend on Western intermediaries or approval. Traoré walked slowly around the monument, observing how the morning light played across the bronze donkey's form. The artist, Kone, had captured something essential in the sculpture, not a heroic or idealized animal, but a real working donkey with all the patient endurance that characterized the species. The expression was perfect, that mixture of stubbornness and calm that anyone who had worked with donkeys would recognize immediately. Children who visited the monument loved to touch the sculpture, and their small hands had polished certain spots to a brighter sheen. The educational impact of the incident continued to surprise him. Teachers across Burkina Faso had incorporated the story into lessons about geology, history, infrastructure, and even philosophy. Students wrote essays analyzing what the collapse revealed about colonial exploitation and its ongoing effects. Science classes used the event as a case study in geological assessment and engineering safety. Civics courses discussed it as an example of how governments should respond to crises, with transparency, comprehensive action, and institutional reform rather than cover-ups or superficial fixes. A small museum had been established near the monument, displaying artifacts recovered from the collapsed mine shaft, colonial-era mining tools, fragments of support beams with French markings, and photographs from the geological surveys. But it also showcased pre-colonial mining artifacts and traditional engineering innovations, telling a fuller story that challenged narratives of African technological backwardness. School groups visited regularly, and Traoré had been pleased to learn that it had become one of the most visited educational sites in the country. Fatoumata, Amadou's widow, had passed away peacefully 8 months ago. Traoré had attended the funeral, sitting among villagers in the traditional ceremony that honored her life and mourned her passing. Her children and grandchildren continued to benefit from the support the government had provided, with several grandchildren now attending university on scholarships established in Amadou's name. They were studying fields ranging from engineering to agriculture to education, each carrying forward in their own way the legacy of a farmer who had never sought recognition but whose quiet integrity had made a lasting impact. The political opposition had largely abandoned their attempts to use the collapse incident as a cudgel against Traoré's government. The comprehensive response and tangible improvements to public safety had made such attacks ring hollow. Even his strongest critics acknowledged that the infrastructure program represented effective governance, though they found plenty of other policy areas to debate and contest. This was healthy, Traoré thought. Democracy required opposition and debate, even if elections remained postponed pending improved security conditions. The security situation in Burkina Faso's northern regions remained challenging, but had shown gradual improvement. The government's strategy of combining military operations with community engagement and development initiatives was yielding results, though progress was slower than anyone wanted. Traoré remained committed to eventually returning to democratic civilian rule, but he insisted that any transition needed to occur in conditions stable enough to ensure its sustainability. Critics called this a convenient excuse for holding on to power. Supporters argued it was responsible stewardship. History would judge. His personal evolution as a leader continued. The near-death experience had fundamentally altered how Traoré thought about mortality, legacy, and the nature of leadership. He had always been driven and focused, qualities that had made him an effective military officer and enabled his rise to power. But the collapse had taught him something about humility and the limits of control. No amount of planning or preparation could account for every variable. Sometimes you were saved by a donkey blocking the road, and all your tactical training and security protocols were irrelevant compared to that one unexpected intervention. This awareness had made him more philosophical, but also, paradoxically, more effective. He worried less about controlling every detail and focused more on building robust institutions that could function regardless of individual leadership. He delegated more authority to capable ministers and administrators, trusting them to exercise judgment rather than requiring his personal approval for every decision. He listened more carefully to advisors who disagreed with him, recognizing that the thing blocking your preferred path might be saving you from unseen danger. Marie Cambou, his chief of staff, had observed that he smiled more now than he had in his first year in office. "You seem less burdened," she had said during a recent conversation. "Am I still serious about the work, but not carrying it all on your shoulders alone?" Traoré had considered this observation. "I think I finally understood something that day on the road. I'm not the hero of this story. None of us are. We're all just playing our parts, doing our work, and sometimes a donkey is more important than a president." That's humbling, but it's also liberating. The sun had fully risen now, bathing the monument and surrounding landscape in bright morning light. Traoré could hear sounds of activity from the nearby village, children's voices, the rhythmic pounding of grain being prepared for breakfast, motorcycle engines starting as people began their daily routines, life continuing in its ordinary patterns, the foundation upon which everything else rested. Without these daily acts of work and care, without people like Amadou tending their fields and families, there would be nothing for presidents and governments to organize or protect. He thought about the future Burkina Faso he was working to build, a country with safe infrastructure and institutions that served the people, a nation that honored both its traditional wisdom and contemporary knowledge, synthesizing rather than choosing between them. A place where ordinary people like Amadou could live with dignity and have their contributions recognized, even if they never sought fame or power. A land of honest people, as Sankara had envisioned, where integrity mattered more than wealth, where community trumped individualism, where African solutions to African problems were sought before turning to foreign powers. It was an ambitious vision, perhaps impossible to fully realize. Every day brought compromises, setbacks, and the friction between ideals and reality. But the vision mattered because it provided direction, a North Star to navigate by even when the path was unclear. And sometimes, when you were moving too fast toward an unseen danger, something would block your way and force you to stop, to reconsider, to notice what you had been missing. Those moments of interruption might be the most valuable of all. Major Ouedraogo approached respectfully. "Mr. President Peter, we should begin the return journey. Your morning briefing is scheduled in 90 minutes. Traoré nodded, but didn't immediately move. He took one last look at the bronze donkey, remembering the feel of coarse hair under his hand, the trembling ground, the dust cloud rising from the collapsed road. How close it had been. How different everything might be if that animal had been elsewhere that morning. If Amadou had sold it or tethered it more securely. If any of 1,000 variables had been slightly different. But they hadn't been different. The donkey had been exactly where it needed to be, doing exactly what it needed to do. And 3 years later, Burkina Faso was a safer place because of what had followed. The investigations, the programs, the national conversation about infrastructure and history, and how the past shapes the present. One animal's stubbornness had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted, touching thousands of lives and changing national priorities. As Traoré walked back to his vehicle, he noticed a young donkey grazing near the monument, probably a descendant of Amadou's faithful companion. The animal raised its head and watched him with that characteristically patient gaze. Traoré smiled and offered a small salute, a gesture that would have seemed absurd to anyone who didn't know the story. But everyone in Burkina Faso knew the story. It had become part of the national narrative, a parable told and retold in schools and homes, in speeches and songs. The convoy pulled away from the monument site, dust rising in its wake. Traoré settled into his seat and pulled out the briefing papers for the day's meetings, economic development proposals, security updates, diplomatic communications, the ordinary work of governance that filled his days and would continue long after the dramatic moments were forgotten. But he knew now that these ordinary moments mattered most, that it was in the daily decisions and incremental progress that nations were built or destroyed. His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Zongo, the geologist leading the Indigenous Knowledge Research Institute. She had discovered another pre-colonial mining site in the eastern region, this one showing evidence of sophisticated ventilation systems that modern engineers found remarkable. "We keep learning that our ancestors were more advanced than colonial narratives suggested," her message read. "Every discovery is a reclamation of our history." Traoré forwarded the message to his Minister of Education with a note about incorporating the findings into school curricula. Another message came from one of Amadou's grandchildren, now studying civil engineering at the University of Ouagadougou. "Thank you for the scholarship, Mr. President. I'm learning to build bridges and roads that won't collapse. My grandfather would be proud. Traoré felt a warmth in his chest reading those words. This was legacy, not monuments or history books, but young people equipped to serve their communities, carrying forward values of integrity and service. As the convoy navigated the roads back toward Ouagadougou, Traoré observed the countryside passing by his window. The landscape looked different now than it had 3 years ago, though not in ways immediately visible. Beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, much had changed. Hundreds of kilometers of roads had been surveyed and reinforced. Countless hazards had been identified and addressed. Knowledge that had been scattered and marginalized was being gathered and preserved. Institutions were being built to outlast any individual leader or administration. The country still faced enormous challenges. Poverty remained widespread. Security threats persisted in northern regions. Drought and climate change threatened agricultural livelihoods, and political tensions simmered beneath the surface. But there was also progress, momentum, a sense that things were moving in the right direction even if the journey was long and difficult. Burkina Faso was writing its own story now, not having it written by colonial powers or neo-colonial institutions. The story wasn't perfect or complete, but it was authentically Burkinabe. Traoré's thoughts returned to that morning 3 years ago, to the heat and dust and the strange standoff, with a donkey that refused to move. In that moment, standing on that road with his hand on the animal's neck, he had been granted a gift. Not just the gift of survival, though that was profound enough, but the gift of perspective. A reminder that leadership required humility, that wisdom came from unexpected sources, that the ordinary could be extraordinary, that sometimes the best action was to stop and pay attention rather than forging ahead. These lessons had shaped his presidency in ways both large and small. They influenced how he structured cabinet meetings, encouraging dissent and devil's advocacy rather than surrounding himself with yes-men. They affected how he engaged with traditional leaders and elders, recognizing that their knowledge complemented, rather than contradicted, modern expertise. They guided his approach to Pan-African cooperation, emphasizing mutual respect and shared learning rather than hierarchical relationships. They informed his personal conduct, reminding him daily that he was a servant of the people, not their master. As the convoy approached the outskirts of Ouagadougou, the urban landscape gradually replacing rural countryside, Traoré prepared himself mentally for the day ahead. Meetings with ministers, briefings from security chiefs, decisions about budget allocations and policy priorities, the endless machinery of governance that consumed his days and nights. But he carried with him the memory of that monument standing in the Sahel heat, honoring a farmer and his donkey, reminding everyone who visited that greatness often wears humble clothes. The presidential compound came into view, its gates opening to receive the convoy. Traoré straightened his red beret and gathered his papers, shifting from the reflective space he had inhabited at the monument back into the role that duty demanded. But he brought with him the renewed sense of purpose that these anniversary visits provided, the reminder of why he had accepted this burden, what he was working to build, who he served. In the end, Traoré thought, leadership was about creating conditions where people could flourish, where their children could dream bigger than their parents had dared, where the weight of history could be acknowledged without being allowed to crush the present. It was about building infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, but institutions and knowledge systems and cultural confidence. It was about honoring both Amadou, the farmer who lived an ordinary life of integrity, and the donkey who somehow knew that danger lay ahead. That morning 3 years ago, a donkey had blocked his convoy minutes before the ground collapsed ahead. In doing so, it had saved not just a president's life, but had catalyzed a transformation in how Burkina Faso understood its past, addressed its present, and envisioned its future. It had sparked conversations about infrastructure and history, about indigenous knowledge and colonial legacy, about the value of ordinary lives, and the mysterious ways that circumstances align to protect what needs protecting. The story would continue to be told long after Traoré was gone, long after everyone who had lived through those events had passed into memory. It would be simplified and mythologized, interpreted and reinterpreted by successive generations, each finding in it the lessons relevant to their times. Some would see divine intervention, others would see fortunate coincidence, still others would focus on the practical lessons about geological surveys and infrastructure planning. All of these interpretations would be valid, because truth was multifaceted, and different perspectives revealed different aspects of reality. What mattered most, Traoré believed, was that the story would endure as a reminder of things easily forgotten in the rush of modern life and the arrogance of power, that wisdom comes from unexpected places, that the humble often carry profound truths, that stopping to pay attention can save you from disasters you never saw coming, that building on solid foundations, geological, institutional, moral, was worth the time and effort it required, that every life had value and significance, whether or not the world recognized it. As he stepped out of the vehicle and into the structured chaos of his daily schedule, Traoré carried these lessons with him. They would inform the decisions he made today, the policies he shaped tomorrow, the legacy he would leave whenever his time in office ended. A donkey had taught him to stop and listen, to notice what he might otherwise have missed, to value the warnings that came from unlikely sources. It was a lesson worth remembering, worth honoring, worth building a nation upon, the land of honest people, moving forward with wisdom drawn from both past and present, building a future on foundations tested and found sound. This was the Burkina Faso that Traoré worked for each day, the vision that guided his leadership, the dream that had been saved by a stubborn donkey on a hot morning in the Sahel. And in that salvation lay not just the continuation of one man's life, but the possibility of a nation fulfilling its potential, honoring its people, and claiming its rightful place in shaping Africa's destiny. The sun climbed higher over Ouagadougou, bringing with it another day of challenges and opportunities, of small victories and persistent struggles, of the ordinary heroism that characterized Burkina Faso's journey. And in a quiet memorial plaza several hours and drive away, a bronze donkey stood patient and eternal, reminding all who visited that sometimes the most important moments in history turn on the smallest actions, and that every life, human or animal, powerful or humble, remembered or forgotten, plays its part in the great unfolding story of a nation and its people. The end